This is the Rational Reminder Podcast, a weekly reality check on sensible investing and financial decision-making from two Canadians. We're hosted by me, Benjamin Felix, and Cameron Passmore, portfolio managers at PWL Capital.
Welcome to episode 189. Kick it off just by a little bit of content. Lisa and I are really into Succession. I don't think you're watching Succession, but it's a really interesting show. It's it's some pretty crazy stories, pretty crazy characters, but it's really enjoyable.
Whoa, what's it about?
Oh, it's about this media family, kind of look like the Murdochs, but a very wealthy American media family, and the father owns the majority, and it's all about the kids positioning to take over the company, and some pretty crazy twists happen, and it's a story of that, but we're talking about over-the-top opulence and wealth.
Interesting.
So, interesting storyline, great characters, really good characters. I was really getting into Billions, and then after season 5, Damian Lewis did not renew his contract, so he's no longer like Axe of Axe Capital. So it's not the same, as I've kind of drifted away from Billions. So it's nice to have Succession to fill in a bit of the gap. Anyways, reading challenges kicked off with a bang, incredible. So we have 260 people in the reading challenge, and there's been 292 books completed so far this year.
Unreal.
Which is unreal. Of course, it's never too late to join. Yes, we're saying 22 and 22, but whatever your personal challenge is, it's totally fine. Like, do what you think is reasonable for you. And we're going to be doing this through to the end of 2023, so there will be a new challenge next year. So Angelica let us know, Ben, that the top books that have been read so far, number 1 is Psychology of Money. Number 2 is Trillions. Number 3 is Dopamine Nation.
All good books.
They're great books. 30 book reviews have been written, and they're really good. I haven't seen them all, but I poked through a bunch of them. There's some really good. So if you're looking for an idea of what to read, scroll through the book reviews. 607 badges have been earned. And yes, there's a welcome badge for all signups. So when you take that out, 347 badges have been earned. So there's some good coupons for the merchandise store that come as you read more books. And any book counts towards the reading challenge. Some people have asked if it has to be personal finance or can it be audio? Whatever works for you, it's totally fine.
Yeah, genre, format, doesn't matter. Audiobooks.
Doesn't matter.
Ebooks, paper books, fiction books.
Yep. We had some feedback that phone numbers are not fitting into the allocated space, so Angelica fixed that. Also heard from somebody that the app doesn't appear to be available in Portugal. I've not heard back from him, so maybe it's worked out. But if you're having trouble in your jurisdiction, let us know and we'll reach out to the program, the Beanstalk people. This week we have, to keep up the momentum, as we told you last time with Heather joining us, that we're going to be having a special guest joining us periodically just to kind of inspire us to read more. So this week it is Neil Pasricha. And neat story, and it links to the book review today, is that I was reading today's book, which is called Humbitious. And in that book, the author mentioned an HBR paper, 8 ways to read a lot more books this year. So of course it tweaked my interest. I did a simple Google search and discovered the author, Neil, who is a Canadian and who has been on 2 previous guests' podcasts before. So he was on the Knowledge Project with Shane Parrish and also on Digging Deep with Mark Sutcliffe. So I pinged Mark and he said, just reach out to Neil. So I tracked Neil's email down and reached out and he responded right away. And what a high energy interview. You're going to love it. Neil's the author of the Awesome series of books. So many people have read that book. And it's there's 4 in that series. He's also the host of the 3 Books podcast, which is pretty cool. He wanted to discover the 1,000 important books you should read, I think, something like that. And he does 3 books per podcast. Really, really interesting podcast. Also worth noting that article, 8 Ways to Read a Lot More Books This Year, was the number 1 downloaded article in the Harvard Business Review in 2017. Another thing I want to let you know about is Angelica and Sandrine had an online contest to choose what book people wanted me to read next. And they chose Making Numbers Count by Chip Heath. So we had 173 people, Ben, that voted on that. So I read it last weekend, loved it. Loved it. So we'll do a review on that in 2 weeks. It's a really fun book, and you realize how important it is to communicate numbers in a way that they make sense. Because we throw around millions and billions and percentages, and these happen. Look at the death rate, for example, from the pandemic, or unemployment numbers, or inflation numbers. And if you don't have a way to relate it back to something that has meaningful measurement to you as a human, these numbers mean nothing. Like the one great example is if you spend $50,000 a day and you had $1 million for getting any sort of growth rate, $1 million will last you 20 days. But if you had $1 billion spending $50,000 a day, it lasts 55 years. It's ways of framing information that really kind of make your head shake. The other interesting thing too, and you talked about this, with Heather a couple of weeks ago, how people learn by reading and extract information from what they read and then capture it. I'm really becoming interested in. And you really spun me around how you do kind of the audio and then the hard copy version, then the digital version in order to search, but you like the hard copy to kind of thumb through and back and forth and highlight. I thought that was really interesting. So I was reading on the weekend, the Making Numbers Count, and I said, there's got to be a kind of way to do your method, but digitally. So I Googled that, and I found a YouTube video on an app called Readwise. And I know I pinged you as soon as I discovered this, but it is super cool when you use a Kindle. You can just highlight, drag your finger, and create a note. Mm-hmm. And I should have known this, but these notes are automatically stored up in the Amazon cloud. Mm-hmm. But Readwise, you can link it to these notes, and it pulls it over automatically, organizes it. It tells you what book it came from, what page it was on, which is great. But then it creates these little flashcards, and you tell it, okay, I want you to prompt me with 5 messages a day at 5:30 in the morning or whatever. And every day these come to you kind of like flashcards. You end up remembering things. I mean, you think of the number of quotes that were in Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. So I've done this now for almost a week, and it is amazing how it organizes and collates these notes. And on top of that, you can link Readwise. I use Evernote, as you know. It links it to Evernote, which then allows you to manage and cut and paste and organize the notes, for example, to help prepare for these notes. It is really cool how it works both ways. Super easy. It's a cheap app. Really impressed with it.
Wow.
Upcoming guest next week, Leonard Mlodinov. And that was a really good interview, wasn't it?
Really good. Yep.
So he's a longtime friend of ours and author of the recently released book, Emotional: How Feelings Shape Our Thinking. And yes, that rash reminder, we're getting into feelings. And the week after that, Morgan Housel will be here, number 1 book that people are reading. So he's going to join us to talk about reading. A week after that, economist and professor Alex Edmonds joins us. He's the author of the book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose, and Profit.
That was another really good one.
Good conversation. And then after that, Larry Swedrow is going to come back and join us. And again, in the reading theme, so Larry is a unbelievable reader.
Yeah.
And he cranks out, he's done it every year now for years, his reviews of all the books he reads. And he's also a prolific author, of course. So I think that will be an interesting conversation, as Larry always is. And the week after that is Bill Janeway, that you got to join us.
Yep. Bill's going to be, I anticipate, another excellent conversation.
Maybe you want to talk about ratings and reviews?
Yeah, well, we always appreciate it when people leave reviews for the podcast and rate the podcast in iTunes or whatever platform you happen to be listening on. It, as we understand, helps other people find the podcast, which is always a good thing. We usually read out the recent reviews from iTunes, but there were not any since last time we read them out. But you, Cameron, got a bunch of LinkedIn messages that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, just nice people reaching out. So Lucas in Stockholm reached out and said the podcast episodes are, to quote him, a game changer. Liam in Doha, Qatar is a huge fan. Edward from South Africa is grateful and wanted to say thanks. There's Jorge here in Canada and Patrick from Philadelphia. So these are the people, a sampling of people I heard from this week. And it's a crazy in a matter of a few days you can hear from all these different parts of the world. The Instagram following is growing. We're over 1,000 followers there, so you can check out Rational Reminder and see some of the great artwork and ideas that Sandrine's putting out. You can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, where there's over 12,000 subscribers. I'm on Peloton at CP313. We have 81 members in the hashtag Rational Reminder group over there, which is pretty cool. And of course, we're both on Twitter. Long intro, I know. Anything else?
We're not supposed to talk about the length. Come on.
I didn't talk about the length. I just said, anyways. Good to go.
Yep, let's go. Welcome to episode 189 of the Rational Reminder podcast.
Okay, so if you enjoyed the discussion of the book, The Culture Code, 2 weeks ago, and if you're in any sort of leadership position, and if you kind of like the style of how Ben and I communicate, you're going to love this book called Humbitious, The Power of Low Ego, High Drive Leadership by Amar Kaisi. I loved this book. Of course, humbitious is the combination of humble and ambitious. And I've been raving about it to so many people, anyone who will listen. I gave it out to a bunch of people here at the office. And I realize I'm biased because it reflects one of our company values, which is compete fiercely but remain humble. So we've long had this as part of our thinking. I think it also reflects the style of our organization, the culture of our firm, which is really, high trust, high delegation, autonomy, high engagement between team members. So again, if you're in leadership at all, I highly recommend this book. And if you recall from our discussion about the Culture Code, the underpinnings to a successful team are the three things: safety, vulnerability, and purpose. And of course, it all intertwines with the idea of humbitious. So the author defines humility as the orientation that represents an underlying belief in one's capacity for substantial growth and self-development, which I thought that's a really interesting framing, because I think a lot of people, and I know I kind of thought of this before, that if you're humble, it's almost like false modesty in some cases. But when you realize it's more about your ability to grow and to look for ways that will help you grow, I just love that way of looking at it. Anyways, there's two big takeaways from this book. One is being humble. Being humble is not a sign of weakness. The author argues that humble people are better able to self-assess. They're more realistic about their performance expectations. They're less likely to meet deadlines and rarely sacrifice the quality of their work.
Less likely to miss deadlines.
Yeah, less likely to miss deadlines.
You said meet deadlines.
Oh, no. You meet deadlines, you're less likely to miss deadlines. So humble people also appreciate the strengths of others and are more likely to notice high performers and model their behavior. And humbitious leaders are humble and ambitious, but the ambition is for the organization, and that's the humility part of this. There's an unwavering resolve to produce long-term performance for the collective, take ownership of poor results, give credit to others, and set standards for a great organization. So again, according to the author, humble people are more open to feedback. They take remedial actions to improve things. Get this, they're more satisfied with their lives, and they're generally more grateful and agreeable and less likely to be pessimistic. More likely to be happier, have greater life aspiration, and higher subjective well-being.
Wow.
And more likely to have meaningful relationships. But again, like the Culture Code, the most crucial ingredient in a team that achieves and sustains historic greatness is not the amount of resources, which is exactly what we talked about 2 weeks ago, the experience of the coach or the loyalty of the fans. It is the character of the captain, is what the author argues. And to be sustainable over a long period of time, you need a captain that leads from the shadows. So it's this combination of selflessness and determination that drives a great team to high performance.
Interesting. We talked a little bit about the importance of leadership with Alex Edmonds too, because his belief is that CEO pay is not a problem, like the high CEO pay. He doesn't think it's a problem because of how important leaders are to value creation.
Exactly. Interesting that the author also talked about how people are seeking systems and they crave learning and exploration. So it's a combination of systems to work in, but the ability to create and explore. And again, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And if ideas are not coming up, he says there is a culture of fear, period. And we talked about safety and vulnerability 2 weeks ago. So again, it all links together. So some of the ideas to create a more ambitious environment. So he says to set up a team to confront challenges with humility and confidence. He says you have to make sure you combine selflessness with fierce determination. I mean, that links perfectly to one of our values. As I said, compete fiercely but remain humble. Model humility by admitting mistakes and shortcomings. That's being vulnerable. And create psychological safety so people feel comfortable developing deep connections, and you empower employees to grow. He also talked about humility. One of the big things to increase your humility is to acknowledge luck, which I thought was interesting. And the last point I wanted to make is he talked about an interview, conversation that Oprah gave at some point. The common denominator, she says, in every one of the interviews she ever did was that everybody wants to be validated. Every interaction you have, people are saying, was that okay? Did you hear me? Did you see me? Did what I say mean anything to you? And he highlights big time that appreciation is the most important need that humans have. And as a ambitious leader, you have the power to help satisfy that need. So I thought that was really interesting. Again,
Very cool, yeah.
awesome book. Check it out. I know you've got a copy.
I think it's in my mailbox. Because I live in the forest now, I have a post office that I have to go to get my mail, and I haven't been for a bit. I'll go pick it up soon.
All right. On to the news stories.
Yeah. So Wealthfront, which is a robo-advisor in the U.S., they, as their headline reads, are updating their smart beta offering. So I'll touch on it later, but Wealthfront's done some other funny stuff in the past. But this time around, what they've decided is that based on intensive research, they're updating the factors that they use, and they're dropping the value factor in their model portfolios, in their smart beta model portfolios, because research suggests, this is their words.
Was that air quotes you're doing there?
Oh, yeah, big air quotes. Research suggests, according to Wealthfront, that value is no longer as effective as it once was. Value is measured using a company's book equity to market value ratio, which is one way to measure value. It's not the only way. But it doesn't account for a company's investment in tangible assets like R&D, brand value, and patents, all of which are becoming increasingly important in today's economy.
Here we go.
So they're dropping value, picking up profitability as a factor. So the Wealthfront model portfolios, the smart beta model portfolios are no longer going to have value, but they will have profitability along with a couple of other factors that they're keeping. They think this is going to improve risk-adjusted returns. Intangibles are an interesting one because that's been part of the anti-value or the anti-book to market value narrative for a while. There's a good paper from Rizova and Sato from Dimensional. The paper's on SSRN for anybody to read. But they did a study of whether incorporating estimates of internally developed intangibles in value and profitability result in larger premiums. I thought it was relevant to just mention these notes because Wealthfront is saying intangibles are the problem. That is why we're dropping value. It's a funny reason they give. We'll see why it's funny in a second. So in this paper, they find that adding estimated internally developed intangibles to book value would have, in fact, had a slightly positive impact on the value premium over the long term. But, and this part's really interesting, the impact is primarily driven by differences in sector weights. So adjusting for sector differences in the regular value portfolio and the value with intangibles portfolio, adjusting for sector differences largely eliminates premium differences in the three regions that they studied, which was, I think, U.S., international, developed, and emerging markets. Now that makes sense because if you take sectors like tech and healthcare, they're going to have more internally developed intangibles. So if you add that into HML, you're going to end up with a sector tilt toward those industries.
Yep.
So neutralize that, and any additional premium goes away. Then they also looked at an adjustment of profitability for estimated internally developed intangibles, because if book equity is adjusted for HML, we should also be adjusting it for profitability, because profitability is scaled by its gross profit scaled by book equity, or operating profitability scaled by book equity. And then you also have to adjust profits, not just on the book side, but you've got to adjust profits by adding back the capitalized portion of SG&A. So you can't just adjust book and not adjust profitability, is what they're saying in this paper. So when you make those adjustments, the profitability premium is slightly lower on average than the adjusted one. So I don't know the details of how Wealthfront is going to be incorporating profitability, but presumably, because of the importance of intangibles, they're going to be including intangibles, presumably. And if they do that, they're going to historically get a slightly lower profitability premium. Which is kind of interesting. I maybe they posted their methodology. I didn't dig that hard. So if we're using the intangibles adjustment, then you get a slightly higher value premium, which kind of fits with the narrative that Wealthfront has going, but you also get a lower profitability premium. So then Rizova and Sato in their paper, they ask what the impact of including the internally developed intangibles has on double sorts of value and profitability. So previously we were just talking about a value portfolio and a profitability portfolio. How do the intangibles affect the premiums? But then they say, what if we do a sort on both variables? So portfolios sorted on value and profitability. And what they found there was that adjusted and unadjusted, the premiums are similar. So you're not getting a higher or lower premium for intangibles if you're doing the double sort on value and profitability. Now that's, for Dimensional, that's interesting because they are doing the sort on value and profitability. And that's kind of been their point all along, is that as everyone's whining about intangibles, Dimensional is saying, well, because we're looking at book to market and profitability, it doesn't actually matter. It kind of seems to come out in the wash. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with noise. They've got another recent paper that came out on, there's a ton of noise in intangibles, in internally developed intangibles. And you can measure that by estimates versus realized on an acquisition. Anyway, so there's a tremendous amount of noise in that figure, which is probably one of the reasons that it's problematic to try and include in measures of expected returns. Now, back to the Wealthfront story. Why is this relevant for investors, or why does this matter? Switching value for profitability is probably inferior to combining value with profitability. Like, we know there's a value premium, although I guess Wealthfront is contesting that. On what grounds, I don't really know. But we also know there's a profitability premium. And I don't know why you would ignore a big chunk of the information that we have about expected returns by dropping value instead of combining it with profitability. Anyway, it was an interesting story because a lot of people kind of picked it up and said, hey, this is kind of weird. So I thought we'd say a few things about it. Now, I mentioned that this isn't the first time that they've done something weird. So in 2018, they launched a risk parity fund, Wealthfront did, and they automatically opted their clients into it. And when they launched it, the fund had a fee of 50 basis points, which compared to the 6 basis point whatever ETFs that they had in their portfolios. And keeping in mind, like, these robo-advisor platforms launched as, hey, we'll give you access to super low-cost ETF portfolios that are automatically rebalanced. And people signed up for that. And then all of a sudden they drop this 50 basis point product into their portfolios that you have to opt out of if you don't want it. And then eventually Wealthfront dropped the fee back to 25 basis points, or down to 25 basis points. But people weren't happy. I looked that fund up. It's performed really badly since then. It's only a few years, so it doesn't really matter. But you can imagine if you're an investor at Wealthfront and you showed up for the low-cost cap-weighted portfolios, and you have this risk parity portfolio shoved down your throat, and it performs horribly relative to the market since inception, you might not be too happy.
Right.
And it's interesting to think about generally, right? Like what was the purpose of these robo-advisor services? To keep people disciplined, to make portfolio management simple for a low cost, to execute and to rebalance. But then you look around, and we've talked about Wealthsimple's in Canada, Wealthsimple's portfolios, and they've done weird stuff too. Not to mention their crypto trading service. It's like there's not a lot of money to be made in helping people make good decisions for low fees. I guess. I mean, that seems to be what's happening.
I guess that's a question, but if you have to stick to your initial mantra, which was, modern portfolio theory, well diversified, low cost, or could they argue that their client base evolved and they're just reflecting the demands?
Yeah. I
don't
know either. Cliff Asness had some good commentary on this. So Cliff quoted the Wealthfront article saying they're dropping value in the quotes in Cliff's tweet. We'll no longer use the value factor in our service as research suggests it is no longer as effective as it once was. And Cliff says, what research? Realized returns at the peak of a bubble? Here's the actual research. And he links to his The Long Run is Lying to You post that we've talked about on the podcast a few times. And then he follows up with that tweet saying, and this is kind of what I was just saying, literally the main way you can add value, you being Wealthfront, for your clients is exactly not doing this, especially now, but in general. You exist in theory to fight such short-term momentum at a value time horizon nonsense. This is an epic, reckless fail. Yep.
That's Cliff.
Yep.
He's got a good point.
Yeah, it's funny though, seeing, because a lot of this happened last year too, where you saw some value managers shutting down and people dropping value as a strategy. And now Wealthfront's doing it too. Only time will tell if they're right, if value is really, really dead, or if they're just capitulating as you'd expect people to do, investing in a volatile risk premium.
Exactly. Okay, on to the big show.
Yeah, so speaking of giving up on value, I wanted to talk about regret. I mentioned in our last episode with just the two of us that I was going to do emerging markets as a topic, but I also had that paper that I mentioned last time that I've been working on, and the last section that I had to write was on regret. So I wanted to finish that, and then ended up taking all the time that I had. So emerging markets will have to wait until a future episode. So financial decisions, kind of like we were just talking about with the value premium, are always going to be surrounded by uncertainty. A good decision made with all the best inputs from being as scientific as you can does not come close to guaranteeing a good outcome. There's just so much uncertainty in financial markets, but also in life. And regret is a unique emotion for people making decisions. Like, you only get to feel regret if you make a decision, which is interesting when you're talking about decision making. It's a fundamental aspect of regret. If you get a bad outcome that you're not happy with, but you didn't make a choice, that's disappointment. But if you make a choice and get a bad outcome, you get regret. And I think it's easy to say, and I've got a YouTube video where I did say this, that you should separate the quality of your decision from its outcome. But I think it's a lot more challenging to suppress feelings of regret if you get an outcome that you're not happy with. Dan Pink in his book explains regret as the stomach churning feeling that the present would be better and the future brighter if only you hadn't chosen so poorly, decided so wrongly, or acted so stupidly in the past. I thought that was pretty good. Pretty good definition of regret.
And give a shout out for that book for the reading challenge. It's an excellent.
It is good. It is good. I agree.
Hopefully we'll have him join us one day.
Yeah. Feelings of regret can be experienced about decision process and also decision outcome. So you can look back and wish that you put more thought into a decision. But you can also just have regret about the outcome itself. And regret in the absence of self-regulatory abilities, and that's an important piece. So people who are not good at self-regulating, frequent episodes of regret are associated with poorer life satisfaction. So there's potentially real implications on enjoying life for regret. So I think understanding regret is important for people making financial decisions. Understanding ways to prevent it and also understanding ways to deal with it, but just understanding what it is, I think is important. So to talk about regret, we've got to talk about counterfactual thinking. Counterfactuals are alternative realities that you construct in your mind when where things turned out differently than reality. So like you might feel regret if you can readily imagine having taken an action that would have led to a more desirable outcome. So that's kind of the mechanism for regret. One of the strongest determinants in forming counterfactuals is closeness. The closer that you were to an alternative outcome, the easier it is to form the counterfactual. So Kahneman and Tversky give the example in the 1982 paper where I think they defined counterfactuals. A passenger who misses a flight by 5 minutes generally experiences more regret than one who misses a flight by 30 minutes because they were closer to
absolutely
making it.
That's a great example.
Closeness is not just about timing. Like in that case, they were 5 minutes away from missing the flight, so it was easy to form the counterfactual. It's the ease with which elements of reality can be cognitively altered to construct the counterfactual. So it's not just about time. It's like if there was one small action that you had done differently, that's also closeness.
Huh.
And there are two main mechanisms that drive counterfactual thought. One is contrast effects. So that's juxtaposing reality against what might have been in an alternative reality. So as an example, winning $50 feels nice if you would have otherwise won nothing. But if you almost won $100, winning $50 does not feel quite as nice. And that one, there's a famous study on Olympic medalists, and this is also in Dan Pink's book.
This was so interesting.
Yeah. So the study authors found that the dominant counterfactual, that I almost came first, which is an upward counterfactual, gives the silver medalist less satisfaction, while the dominant counterfactual, that I almost came in fourth and didn't medal, which is a downward counterfactual, gives the bronze medalist more satisfaction. So bronze medalists at the Olympics are happier than silver medalists. And I think it's been studied out of their initial sample as well, with similar results. It's pretty interesting. Empirically upward counterfactuals, those are the if only whatever, things would have been better, are much more commonly experienced than downward counterfactuals, which is the at least things could have been worse. So that's interesting too, right? If you think about counterfactuals, people aren't as often walking around thinking, well, at least that happened. Things could have been worse. They're more likely to be thinking, if only things would have been better. So that's important. The other mechanism for counterfactuals is causal inference effects. I think this one's particularly important for financial decision making. So causal inference effects are the result of imagining an alternative reality. For that reality to exist, there has to be a set of alternative facts. If everything else in the alternative reality is the same except for a single action believed to be the causal force behind the outcome, then it feels like changing that action would change the outcome. Now, the problem is that changing that one action in a future situation may not give you the same outcome as it would have in the past. So using stocks as an example, say you decided to sell a stock before it increases in price substantially. So you're kind of kicking yourself for having done that. Your action of selling might be perceived by you as the causal force behind the outcome. And the counterfactual, therefore, involves not selling the stock, holding on to it for its price increase. And the causal inference is that if you had not sold, you would have gotten the better outcome. Now, and I think stocks are a particularly good example for this. This is only true if all of the other facts, including the stock price increase, are the same. And when you think about the enormous positive skewness in individual stock returns, that's pretty unlikely. So causal inference can lead to an incorrect application of the perceived causal relationship, holding onto the stock in my example, to future decisions. And another way to think about that is that it's something called base rate neglect, where you neglect the base rate that most stocks don't go to the moon. So those are the mechanisms. This next piece I find absolutely fascinating. Empirically, what do people regret? And some of this comes from Dan Pink's book. Some of it comes from a 2011 study by Morrison and Ruiz. So empirically, Dan Pink in his 2020 U.S. regret survey finds that people's regrets most commonly involve family, 21.8% of the sample, partners, 19.2%, education, 15.6%, career, 15.1%, finances, 13.5%, and health at 6.6%. And most people regret inaction, so not doing something, rather than action. So people regret their inactions more frequently than they regret their actions. So that's Dan Pink's 2020 finding. And then Morrison and Ruiz in a representative U.S. sample, pretty similar findings. Romance is the most common, 19.3%. Keeping in mind, Dan Pink found partners, which is similar at 19.2%. Morrison and Ruiz find family is the next. And again, that was also top in Dan Pink. Education, career, finances, and parenting. It's pretty common threads across those two samples. Kind of interesting to see. In the Morrison and Ruiz sample, they had it broken down by demographics as well. So they found that women and people not currently in a relationship are more likely to have romantic regrets. Men and better educated respondents are more likely to have career regrets. And over time, regrets about action tend to dissipate, while regrets about inaction linger for longer. It's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. Dan Pink in his book classifies regret into 4 categories. And I thought this was also useful to think about it. So foundational regrets, and this is based on his U.S. regret survey, and he's also got a world regret survey. And based on reviewing thousands of responses from that, he figured that regrets generally fall into these 4 buckets, kind of like factors, I guess, for regrets. So foundational regrets, actually maybe not, because I don't know if they would overlap. Factors probably isn't a good analogy. So foundational regrets stem from failures in foresight, responsibility, and prudence with long-term consequences. So these are like small decisions that are immediately enjoyable or not a big deal, but they have long-lasting effects due to compounding. So overspending and undersaving, it's a good example. Doesn't hurt so bad, or maybe even feels good at the time, but then one day you're 65 years old and don't have savings, and it kind of hits you all at once. Not exercising, I think, is another good one, where watching Netflix instead of working out seems like not that big of a deal, but then you start having health issues and it kind of hits you all at once. Smoking is another good one. Drinking too much, not eating well, and giving up on education is another one. So those are foundational regrets, and probably stems from temporal discounting. People tend to favor the present at the expense of the future when they're making decisions, and that's pretty well documented. It could also be a weak connection with the future self, like we talked with Hal Hirschfield about. But in either case, the empirical result is future regret. And in Dan Pink's book, he says that foundational regrets take years or decades to materialize. And the nature of compounding on financial assets and other aspects of your life is probably what makes it hit you suddenly. And compounding is not easily understood by people, which makes this even more problematic. It seems like all of those little actions or inactions are not a big deal. And it's hard to think about the exponential effects that they might have, which is why it feels like those regrets hit you all of a sudden, all at once. Boldness regrets, the next category. So those are the result of playing it safe, followed by the counterfactual, where taking the risk that you didn't take would have resulted in a better life. So this could be missed romantic connections, which remember is a common regret. Declined job opportunities, or maybe not starting a business. Long-term, maybe holding individual stocks fits into this one too. If you had a position in a single stock that did go to the moon, but you did sell it, maybe you'd look back and wish that you took that risk. In the long term, people tend to regret things that they failed to do more than the things that they did do. So that's the inaction thing that I mentioned earlier. And those inactions don't tend to dissipate in the same way that actions do. So even if you regret an action, that regret will tend to dissipate, but regrets about inaction won't tend to. Moral regrets are the next category. So that's doing things that felt wrong. So Dan Pink uses Jonathan Haidt's 2012 moral foundations theory to kind of categorize moral regrets. Hurting people. So that's through stuff like bullying or insults or ghosting romantic interests. Cheating, which could be in relationships or in school, or stealing, stuff like that. Disloyalty, by falling short of obligations to a group. Subversion through disrespect to parents or teachers. And desecration or violating sanctity. Those are moral regrets. And then connection regrets, which I think Dan Pink says are the biggest category from all the responses that he collected. So those are the biggest one, and it's letting go of relationships or letting relationships break down and not fixing them was a big one, and that's one that you can maybe do something about, because if you have situations like that, you typically can go back to a person and rekindle a relationship. Maybe, I don't know if typically it's the right thing to say there, but in some cases you can do that. And then of course there's all the research on how important relationships are, so it shouldn't necessarily be surprising this is an important category of regret. And there's also a paper from Morrison, Epstein, and Ruiz, 2011 paper, and they find that regrets involving primary social relationships, being romance and family, are felt more intensely than less socially based regrets, like work and education, suggesting that social connectedness plays a central role in what people regret the most. Pretty interesting.
Indeed.
Yeah. So preventing future regret. So we kind of get the idea that regret is something that you maybe want to avoid if possible. Future regret can be moderated or eliminated by improving decision quality, increasing decision justifiability, transferring decision responsibility, ensuring decision reversibility if possible, and avoiding feedback about unchosen alternatives. Like that last one's pretty interesting. So improving decision quality, it's really like being more thoughtful about decisions. So I kind of thought of Heath and Heath, the same Heath I think that wrote your numbers book.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier. So they suggest a framework in their book, Decisive, widening your options, reality testing your assumptions, attaining distance before deciding, and preparing to be wrong. But in general, improving decision quality is one way to minimize the chance of future regret. Increasing decision justifiability, and this one's fascinating. So making normal decisions generally produces less regret than switch decisions, like, unusual decisions. But it's challenging because normal decisions aren't always good. You think about regret aversion in investing can lead people to popular investments, whether that's popular stocks or cap-weighted index funds, I don't know, stuff like that. And it's the whole concept of tracking your regret, I think we can tie into that, where if you do something that's different from what most people are doing, your chances of feeling regret are going to be much greater. I also thought about this one for housing. If you choose to rent when when it's normal to buy, and then the real estate market goes up, you might feel worse than if you choose to buy and the real estate market goes down. Because in that case, you're kind of doing the normal thing and you're in it with everybody else. Doesn't feel as weird. It's not to say that buying a house is the right decision, but I think that exposure to potential regret is at least worth thinking about. Another way to reduce potential regret is transferring decision responsibility. And I'm not saying the papers these are from, but there's citations for all these that we can maybe put in the podcast notes. So transferring decision responsibility reduces regret by making another party, typically an expert, responsible for the decision. And since I mentioned it, that's a Zeelenberg and Peters 2007 paper. When decisions are reversible, people anticipate less regret. This one's fascinating too. So if a decision is reversible, people anticipate less regret, but they may experience more regret because reversibility increases counterfactual thinking. Crazy, right? So if you make a reversible decision, people anticipate less regret, but then as they go on through time, they may experience more regret because they're always thinking about the option to reverse the decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. And I thought that was interesting too, because one of the most common questions, not everybody asks this, but it's definitely a very common question when we're talking about asset allocation with PWO clients. It's very common to say, well, we can change it, right? You notice that too?
It's true. Yeah.
And that's clearly an investigation about reversibility. And then another tactic for avoiding regret is avoiding feedback about unchosen options. So it kind of relates to the last thing that I just mentioned there, where if you don't see how the alternatives turned out, then you don't have an opportunity to feel regret because there's no counterfactual.
Speaking of future regret, was it Pink's book that talked about Alfred Nobel?
Not sure. I don't know if I remember seeing that in there.
I think it was another book I read, and it was all kind of melding together. But an example I read was Alfred Nobel was a chemist who I guess created dynamite and explosives. And his brother passed away, but they accidentally wrote the obituary about him in the paper. And I guess he got slammed for having created dynamite and some of the bad things that came from that. So that's when he didn't want that to be his legacy, which I guess is effectively a future regret for when he did pass away. So he repositioned his life and created the Nobel Prize and funded it. So now he's known, obviously, after his passing for having created this, and that's his legacy as opposed to being I don't know if he created dynamite, but he was a chemist behind dynamite. Just thought that was interesting how he had a decade to basically rebuild his brand.
That is interesting. Okay, so we talked about preventing future regret, managing current regret. So if there's stuff that past decisions that are currently being regretted can be reduced by undoing the decision, if possible, justifying the decision, or reappraising the quality of alternatives. People are more likely to undo decisions of action than inaction. I think that's a practical thing. Like, it's harder to undo decisions of inaction because of the compounding stuff that we talked about. If you didn't do something 20 years ago, it may be harder to go and just do that thing now. Whereas if you did do something, it might be easier to go and, apologize for it, kind of thing. But they're not all actions or inactions are reversible, of course. When they're irreversible, justifying the decision, or in Dan Pink's words, taking an at least perspective on the decision, can reduce regret. An alternative counterfactual perspective that may minimize regret is the even if perspective, where the outcome is equally bad even if a different decision had been made. So that's reappraising the quality of alternatives. And then the last piece I think is really interesting on this topic is embracing regret. And this is one of the things I took away from Dan Pink's book, is regret's not always bad. So that uncomfortable feeling that I described earlier using Dan Pink's quote can actually improve future decisions, boost performance, and deepen meaning. Regret aversion's been shown people to make, has been shown to make decision makers take significantly longer to reach a decision and to collect significantly more information before making a choice. It's interesting. And that's Reb 2007. That's where that came from. Upward counterfactuals, that's the if only things would have been better. Heighten the intention to perform success facilitating behaviors and engender greater improvement on a task. Through counterfactual reflection, the upsides to reality are identified. A belief in fate emerges, and ultimately more meaning is derived from important life events. That's Cray, A.L., 2010. So based on on that. The popular phrase, and this Dan Pink also talks about this in his book, the popular phrase of no regrets might not actually be a sensible objective. Regrets are normal and can actually be beneficial. And empirically, this is also very interesting. People value their regrets more than they do their other negative emotions. Interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. Great summary. Great book. Anything else to add to that?
No, I don't think so. That, like I mentioned earlier, that was the last section that I needed to finish in a paper that I've been working on. So that we'll try and release in the next few weeks.
So instead of talking sense this week, can I ask you the question I mentioned before we started recording?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for it.
So I think it's a question that Shane Parrish asks on the Knowledge Project, which is, what are you obsessed with these days?
Yeah, I still don't have a good answer. I don't know. I spent the last couple of weeks reading about regret. I don't know if I was obsessed with it, though. I don't know if I can honestly say that I have obsessions.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess it depends on the definition of obsession.
Are you obsessed with something right now?
I'm not crazy about the word obsession. It sounds like you've gone overboard, but I'm really interested in, and you can tell by the book reviews, I'm really interested in how to enable what frameworks, what tools, what communication styles, what knowledge do you need, and how do you package that knowledge to help a team be all that they can be? Because we've grown pretty quickly and people's roles are evolving quickly and people are developing quickly. And what is the best way to make sure that we all get a chance to do what we think we can do? And how do you discover what you're really good at? I mean, there's a lot of creativity. I mean, this reading challenge is one example. This whole thing about regret in the paper you're doing is another example. Like, we have this culture where you just kind of take an idea and run with it, and we throw the reading idea to our great marketing team, and they come up with stuff, and they find the program that make it all work. Well, it's how do you keep that scaling? How do you ensure everyone's fulfilled? How do you keep lines of communication open? What's the best methodology? How do you train people? How do you train people? How do you learn? Because this is something, when we were smaller, it was only kind of part of each of our brains, but now it's becoming a bigger part as more and more people are managing more and more people. So that's my latest quasi-obsession, I guess.
That's pretty cool.
And it's hard because there's so much material. A lot of it is somewhat similar, but then it's also the, what is the best way to help people to learn it? Do you teach it? Is it self-taught? Is there a multimedia format? Is it a mentorship? Is it how do you do that?
It's probably a combination, but yeah, not an easy problem to solve.
And I may be over obsessed about it, because I know some large companies that kind of don't think about this as much, and other smaller companies that have a whole training system in place. So is it something that's right for you and your organization, or are there best practices regardless of the size or style of the company? Anyways, it's fun to figure out.
Very interesting. Speaking of, you reminded me of the other project that we recently started exploring. In our last episode, with just the two of us, we talked about goals, and I wasn't convinced that was going to be an episode that people would find particularly interesting. Ended up being, I think, the biggest driver of new signups into the Rash Reminder community ever, because people were interested in hearing about other people's goals and sharing their own goals. So that was interesting. Wasn't expecting that at all. Good to see, though. But the idea that it gave me is kind of like, and I guess reading Dan Pink's book helped me with this too, but Dan Pink had these regret surveys where he had questions about regret that he put on a website and had thousands of people fill them out, and then he used that to do research. And I think we can do something similar with financial goals. One of the things we talked about in the previous episode is that people aren't great at identifying what their objectives are. And one of the tools that you can use to help with that is a goals master list, but we don't have that. And so how do you get that? Well, you collect the goals from a whole bunch of people and then kind of do what Dan Pink has done. You assemble them into, synthesize them down into common elements, and then create a tool that people can reference. So if you sit down and say, hey, what are your objectives? We know people are only going to get about 50% of what is actually important to them down. But if we have the master list to give to them, it'll help spur their thinking, and they'll say, oh yeah, that other thing is actually really important. So we're doing that. We're working on building a form on our website, and we'll roll that out probably internally with employees, maybe to PWO clients, and in the Rational Reminder community and elsewhere. Like maybe we share it on LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot. We'll see how many responses that we can collect, and then we'll synthesize it down into a master list of goals. So based on the response from people, just when we talked about this, I imagine there'll be pretty good uptake for filling out this little survey that we're creating. But we'll announce that when it's ready. But just so people know, that is something that we're working on.
And I think the results are going to be fascinating.
Yeah, they'll probably be fascinating, and they may well be exactly what you'd expect, or not. I don't know.
I don't know. Okay, shall we go to our conversation now with Neil?
Let's go hear about reading and how to read more and why reading is important.
So here's our conversation we had with Neil Pasricha. Neil Pasricha, welcome to the Rational Reminder podcast, and thanks so much for contributing to our reading challenge.
My pleasure, Cameron. Felix, thanks for having me.
It's so great to meet you. So tell us, why do you think reading is so important?
There is no better form of compressed knowledge, period. We have not figured out a better way to improve upon the idea, the way you can get into thoughts, you can get into emotions, you can get into like the nuance of anything. I mean, when you watch Big Little Lies on HBO Max, Cameron, you're watching someone else directing. They choose the sets, they choose what Reese Witherspoon wears, they choose what the music plays, they choose everything. But when you read that book, you're the director. I think there's a reason there's a Game of Thrones quote that says, a reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one.
That's some serious reading enthusiasm. I love it. So, Neil, Cameron discovered you through an article in the Harvard Business Review that was published in 2017.
Yeah,
I read the article. It's fantastic. But the world has changed, a lot since then. Has your view of reading changed at all?
Yeah, sure. So that article is called 8 Ways to Read a Lot More Books This Year, where I suggest 8 simple practices you can do, like putting a bookshelf at your front door, for goodness sake. There couldn't be simpler ideas. And yeah, in a way, the world has changed. There's a lot more stuff attacking our brains. We got to be on sort of like a defense all the time for all the things that want to hook our attention and feed us endless ads. I do think, to your point, because the news media's goal isn't to give us the news, right? It's to make us look at detergent jingles. MSNBC's goal isn't to give us the news, it's to sell us Subarus. Let's be honest. Instagram's goal isn't to make us new friends, it's to sell us a 21-day juice cleanse, right? So we have to be even more defensive. We have to move the TV even further away. We have to keep the screens even more out of the bedrooms, and we have to think of our reading vestibules or your reading home, whatever it is for you, as this sort of protected little nest where you can have clear thoughts to yourself with the clear voice in a book.
So before that article that Ben mentioned came out, you were not reading a whole lot, but you cranked it up to reading like 50 to 100 books a year.
Because I got shamed by my girlfriend.
That was the impetus for the change?
She came over. She's now my wife, Leslie. She comes over to my apartment and she's like, "Where's all your books?" And you probably know that old quote: if you go to someone's house and they don't have any books, don't bleep them. You've probably heard that old quote. It's like printed on the side of like tote bags and stuff. So she's like, "Where's all your books?" I was like, who's got time to read anymore? Come on. Yeah, I read Twitter. Yeah, I read email. Yeah, I read a good, long, juicy magazine article in the New Yorker once in a while. But who's got time to read books? And she looked at me with like this stricken face. She's like, "Oh, you don't read books? Are you kidding me?" I was like, "Oh yeah, 5 books a year." slow burners on the bedside table, a couple of books on the beach vacation. She's like, Neil, books are everything. I was like, I know I used to love books when I was a kid, when people used to read. She's like, really? And then over the next year, to your point, Cameron, I changed a number of things in my life. I canceled cable. I canceled 5 magazine subscriptions. I canceled 2 newspaper subscriptions. I started announcing what books I read in the form of an email list. So I had a little bit of monthly pressure. Everybody, my mom's going to read this email, so I got to tell her what books I read. And then when that list grew to 10, 20, 40 people, that helps. So these simple little things, I kind of was proud of myself for increasing my reading rate, wrote this article, it hits #1 in HBR, and now I'm known as this reader guy. And so now I feel like I need to live up to that identity.
So how did that morph into the 3 Books podcast?
Yeah, so that article came out in HBR in 2017. Like I mentioned, it was one of those viral articles, and it was sent around and so on. And it tipped off for me this idea. And think about the title of that piece: How to Read, in brackets, a lot more books this year. Well, you couldn't ask for better clickbait. I don't think that was the title I gave them when I submitted my Word document to HBR, but they know something that I didn't, which is that everybody, when given the invitation, likes to read more, but they don't think they can. And when I ask people, why don't you think you can? They say 2 problems. Number 1, I got no time. And to this one, I say, you're wrong. The University of California says the average person consumes 200,000 words per day. It's called Instagram comments, blog feeds, news headlines. Never mind, the average knowledge worker gets 147 emails a day. So I'm calling BS on this idea that you don't have time to read. I'm saying get rid of 20 pages of garbage and add 20 pages of a book. Even at that rate, you'll read 20 books a year. 65% of Americans read 0 books for pleasure last year. That's a huge jump. The second complaint I always get, though, that's the first one is, of course, the time. The second one I always get is, well, what am I supposed to read? You go on Amazon, there's 200 million books. When you pick a book, you grab War and Peace by Tolstoy, you get 5 pages in, you quit, you think you suck. You think I'm not a good reader. Well, actually, that's not the problem. The problem is we don't have a good discovery mechanism in the publishing world to help this specific reader with this specific desire. They like this pacing. They like this type of comic timing. We don't have a good model to match those together unless you've got a wonderful librarian or a wonderful bookseller kind of at your disposal. So to answer your question, in 2018, I started a podcast to address that. My podcast is called 3 Books, and I've decided to spend 15 years of my life looking for the 1,000 most formative books in the world. I fly around, or do it virtually during the pandemic, asking people, big name people and small name people. I ask people like Malcolm Gladwell, Brené Brown, Quentin Tarantino, Judy Blume, George Saunders, David Sedaris, which 3 books most changed your life, right? And I think they say yes to me just because it's a weird question. They don't get asked much. There's no other real reason to say yes to me, a small town potato guy from Toronto. But then I also ask a bookseller that I love, a librarian that I meet, the world's top ranked Uber driver. We did an episode in the back of his Uber, and I'm trying to capture the biggest, broadest, diverse set of people passionate about reading, because in my mind, it's been the biggest lever for me, and I haven't said this yet, to becoming a better husband, a better father, a better writer, a more intentional person. Reading has given me a sense of groundedness and created space in my life to actually achieve a lot of things I've done over the last few years. It's been wonderful. So the 3 Books podcast was created as a bit of an output of the feedback I heard from the 2017 article in HBR.
You mentioned earlier ditching your TV, cutting cable, stuff like that. How important do you think it is to have a physical space dedicated to reading?
Well, I'll tell you what, I was thinking about this because you were kind enough to say, we're going to ask you about this physical spacing. And I thought, wait a minute, I read everywhere. But then I thought about it a little bit more. I thought, but I'm very careful. I do not have any screens anywhere upstairs in my house. And when we bought our house, I guess the guy who lived here before was like a sports agent or something. There was a plasma stuck on every wall. Now we don't have anything anywhere. And I have a very strict policy, no screens in the bedroom. Okay. Look, the research from Australia shows that if you look at a bright screen an hour before bedtime, your brain does not produce as much melatonin overnight. I mean, that's the sleep hormone, guys. Like, you don't get that. You wake up, you got low resilience. You need a dopamine hit. Give me what's going on in the Hang Seng Index. You know what I'm saying? Like, you need something in the morning. But if you get the phone completely out of the bedroom, you don't look at screens an hour before bed. So I guess the dedicated reading place is the screen-free bedroom. Then guess what happens? Well, I got nothing else to do. I got this book here. After a couple pages, the first couple pages kind of itchy. I'm going to confess, kind of itchy. My anxious social media addled brain is looking for a little bit more. But once I get into the rhythm of it and the flow of it, then what happens is the next day, if I can hold on to that sensation, the news AM radio, that's the thing that sounds grating and overwhelming now. You just have to get your mind back into a slower kind of vibe. It's hard to explain, but readers will know what I'm talking about.
So 2 weeks ago, we kicked off an online reading community, our challenge site. So what do you think about making a public commitment to reading more?
I think it was one of my 8 things in that article, and I believe it heavily. Look, I think there is something, when I first signed up for a Goodreads account, I was like, who is going to go through the trouble of saying, oh, it's on my to be read list? Then I started reading it. Now I'm on page 112 of 402. People actually update this thing every day. And then then I'm done. And then it's added to my finished pile I'm like, what's the point? And they don't care if anyone's reading it. They're making a public commitment. Then you got 3 people following your reviews. You feel indebted to them. It adds a bit of pressure. For me, it was an email list. For some people, it might be Goodreads. For some people, it might be Twitter. And for others, it might be this wonderful reading challenge you're doing. A public commitment adds a positive pressure. Same as betting 3 friends that you're going to lose 5 pounds.
Through your podcast, you get to ask some pretty interesting people what books have been impactful to them. Where else do you find ideas for books to read for yourself?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned this because literally a minute ago, before we started chatting, my wife says to me, oh, Neil, could you post on Twitter? I'm looking for a new book. Here are 6 books I liked. And she's saying books that, just different than the books I like, right? She's like, The Help, The Time Traveler's Wife, The Book of Negroes. Well, I don't know what the 4th book is in that sequence, right? So I just posted on Twitter within 1 minute. And I don't have a big, huge, gigantic following. I've already got 20 recommendations for my wife. So that's one. Here's what I would say to avoid, okay? Avoid the bestseller lists. Avoid the piles at the front of the airport. And avoid the piles at the front of the bookstore. The piles at the front of the airport and the bookstore are paid for. They're paid for by co-op dollars, and that money is essentially part of a giant marketing spend for the biggest, most popular authors and their biggest, most popular books. Unfortunately, what we end up doing by promoting 20 books at the expense of the other 1,980 that came out that week is we neuter the public discourse and the public taste and the huge variety of minds and souls that we have. Instead of giving someone this weird George Saunders books of short stories that might hit them right in the gut, and it's got the good pacing and it's funny and it's a nice little invitation. It's only 200 pages long. We end up putting a giant, and I won't use any names because I'd be insulting people, but we end up putting the giant kind of news anchor's biography that just came out. But it's like, man, if I picked up that thing, I'm going to think I hate reading. I'm going to think I hate reading. So you got to go to the side aisles, find the booksellers, go online and ask for recommendations, and talk to the most interesting people you can find and ask them which books changed their life.
So true confession, Neil, do you read every book you start through to the end?
No, I absolutely don't. So I grew up, I was born in Oshawa, Ontario, Canada, 1979, just to give people a little picture of growing up in the 80s and 90s. You get assigned a book in ninth grade, Lord of the Flies. You got to read that thing beginning to end. Sure, you might buy the Coles notes or the Cliff notes afterward, but you got to read that book. Well, you got to find out what happens to Piggy in chapter 13. But now I actually have decided to embrace my social media addled brain, and especially in nonfiction. So I'll make a nonfiction sort of declaration here. I read a book like I'm eating at a buffet, and the book is the buffet. So if you go to like a big Chinese buffet, hashtag 2019, you're like, what are all the smells? What are all the sights? Where do I want to start first? I want to grab this slice of roast beef, and maybe I'll throw a little dessert on the side of the plate. Guess what? I read the back. I might check out the flap copy. I'll read the table of contents. Hey, what's in the index? Do I know any of the people or studies mentioned? What do they say about that? Oh, this chapter 14 sounds really fascinating. Let me read chapter 14 now. Great context. I think I'll read the intro. And I'm almost like eating the book, kind of like I'm at a buffet. And by the way, at the end of the book, I might only have consumed 50% of the information or wisdom available. but I consider it a done book when I'm done with it, not when it's done with me.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's typically how I read books too. Do you read physical or digital? And do you think it matters?
I do think it matters. And just to insert into that thing, there's a sub point I was trying to make there, which is no book shame, no book guilt. This is the biggest value I have on my podcast, 3 books. It's called No Book Shame, No Book Guilt. And you know what I tell people this? Everyone breathes a sigh of release. You mean you don't have to have read War and Peace? No, you're fine to read comic books your whole life. You're fine to read young adult. You're fine to read what's interesting to you. Don't think the biggest, thickest, fattest books make you any smarter. Because to tell you the truth, most people haven't got through the Jared Diamond book, if you want to be honest. Now, flash forward to your next question. Here's what I do know. The research shows that if you read on a device where you can do anything else, you will. I got that from Seth Godin. I interviewed him in chapter 3 of my podcast. He's told me that research is very clear. So if you read on a device like an iPad, where you can get text message alerts and notifications, that's a horrible way to read. I don't know why Oprah's going around. I'm about to get a poison dart in my neck here. I don't know why Oprah's going around telling people to read on an iPad. I'm sure she's getting paid by Apple to do so. But I think that's a horrible idea. Single tasking is the new multitasking. I am a real book person because it gets you off a bright screen. But if you happen to be a Kindle person or an Audible person, as long as you're following the adage that single tasking is the new multitasking and you can't do anything else on your reading device, great. Personally, though, I know how much time and effort. I just picked up a book, if any people can see me. There. I know how much time. What's the color? What's it feel like? What kind of font do we use? How big is the paper? There's so much thought into the packaging of the book. And I think we are neutering, to use a word twice that I really never use at all. We are neutering the reading experience when we make it try to fit into our devices. Get off the devices. Believe me, there's nothing like reading a real book. Personal opinion.
I must say that's the most compelling argument for physical books that I've ever heard. It's really interesting. So over your right shoulder, you have a lot of books in your bookshelf. Do you keep all your books?
No, I only have 2. So thank you for pointing that out. This is just my fiction. I file all my books in the Dewey Decimal System. I find this very, very, very helpful. Inside the front jacket copy of a book, it says DDC, that number. You can download an app called Decimator. You can find, listen, there's a reason every library in the world is organized in Dewey Decimal. Then you're like, oh, I really need to spruce up on my knowledge of science. I have a huge gap in 593 fungi. And I just find that it makes my knowledge feel periodic table-ish, So this is just 813. This is just 81354. This is just fiction. Upstairs is all my nonfiction. And I only keep 2 books on my bookshelf to answer questions. I only keep books I love and books I have not read. That wide chasm or chasm, whatever that word is, in between books I like, books I thought were pretty good, books I thought were okay, books I didn't like some, they're out. I only keep books I love and books I have not read. Everything in between gets going to a little free lending library. It gets being sold back to a used bookstore because I want the turnaround time on my book to be very fast. And this is one of my 8 points in the article. I want to think of my bookshelf as a dynamic organism. I want to think of it like a living, breathing thing, not a static dust collecting piece of wallpaper.
Neil, this has been great. Any last words or advice for our listeners who might want to read more this year?
Well, I'll just close off with what I say at the end of every single chapter of my podcast, which is you are what you eat and you are what you read.
Very nice.
Neil, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for the energy. And I think you had an impact.
Thank you guys for having me. This is a wonderful podcast, and I'm really, really grateful for the work you guys are putting out into the world. Thanks so much. Wonderful being in the podcast solar system with you.
Thanks.